is going to be, as Hudson mentioned, around federal agency and performance management, moderated by Jeff Press from the Department of Commerce.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I first want to thank Socrata for this amazing event, and thank you for inviting me and our amazing panel here today. I personally just love when I'm in the company of other fellow performance geeks and data geeks and 500 other performance data geeks across the Reagan building today. So it's great to be here. Today's session is all about how we're approaching data-driven decision-making in the federal government, and the various approaches to performance management that we've both seen work and not work. And we're going to have a discussion about that. I'm going to ask the panelists to share their thoughts on a couple questions, but we also really want to make sure that your questions are heard as well. So we'll make sure to save some time at the end for you to ask any questions that you might have. I'm going to introduce the panelists real quick, give just a primer on the topic for about 5 minutes around data and government, data-driven decision-making, and then we'll jump into our dialogue. So first I want to introduce Kate Josephs, directly to my left. Kate is the Executive Director of the Performance Improvement Council, and the PIC is a government-wide council that is focused on advancing the practice of performance management across the federal space. Kate actually was a civil servant in the UK government, both in the Treasury Department, and she was also the Deputy Director of the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit and reported to Prime Minister Gordon Brown. I would say that I was actually on the PIC and worked with Kate for a brief period of time, and I will say it was an HR miracle to actually get you on board and get your talents in the US government. I don't think there's ever been another example of a foreign national working in the US government quite in this way, so thank you, Kate. Yeah, I probably shouldn't say that. Everyone just keep your earmuffs. Next we have John Dessenberg. John is the policy director for the Performance Institute, and he works to advance their mission to move forward on issues of accountability and performance. John spent 14 years as a federal manager in the federal space and has a tremendous amount of knowledge around performance management and improvement. So thank you, John, for being here. We also have Robert Shea. Robert is the principal at Grant Thornton, in charge of both marketing and communication functions as well as performance management issues. He worked at OMB under the Bush administration and was actually the associate director for administration and government performance, primarily responsible for leading the implementation of the president's management agenda under the Bush administration, as well as the program assessment rating tool. So thank you, Robert, for being here. We also have Jatinder Kohli. Jatinder is a director at Deloitte and the government performance leader for Deloitte. He is a globally recognized expert on government reform and also spent many years in the UK government as a senior civil servant. So we actually have the table split here. We have 2 representatives from the US government, 2 from the UK government. It's fantastic.
It's us against them.
That's right. We have them split up, though. So it's kind of US in the center, and then the UK is flanking on the sides. So I mean, I think overall, in terms of the topic of data-driven decision-making in government, I think it's funny how this phrase has really become somewhat of a buzzword, right? I mean, it's like everywhere you look, whether it be at this event, other departments, federal agencies, state and local. I personally don't know if there was ever another way, you know? I mean, when we talk about data-driven decision-making, it's like, what's the alternative? Like, management by Ouija board, or like look at my magic 8-ball and it tells me an answer. So I think it's important to highlight that this is nothing new. Like most things, I mean, these movements are rooted in history and in past experiences, but thanks to technology, I think we've come a long way in uncovering more innovative ways to use data, to display data, to visualize data, and I think that's really become a huge game changer. So when I was thinking about today's panel and what I thought the focus might be, I remembered a good paragraph in the book Good to Great. How many folks have read the book Good to Great? It's okay, great.
Good.
Yeah, good. That's good that you've read Good to Great. About data and Winston Churchill, a paragraph in there about data and Winston Churchill. And I'm not using this because we have 2 friends from the UK civil service on the panel. But it really resonated with me, and I hope it resonates with you. I'm just going to read it really quick. Jim Collins said, "Armed with his bold vision, Churchill never failed to confront the most brutal facts. He feared that his towering, charismatic personality might deter bad news from reaching him in its starkest form. So early on in the war, he created an entirely separate department outside of the normal chain of command called the Statistical Office. with the principal function of feeding him continuously, updated and completely unfiltered, the most brutal facts of reality. He relied heavily on this special unit throughout the war, repeatedly asking them for the facts, just the facts. Wow, right? I mean, so this has been going on for a long time. I think we need special units like this across the entire federal government, maybe not so secretive, and maybe hopefully ingrained in the regular way that we do business in our organizations, but we need them. And I think we're starting to see them pop up in various forms, whether it be a data team at GSA or in the White House, or the emergence of more performance teams across government. So I think it's happening. But there's a very real cultural barrier here that I think Jim Collins hits on in his book Good to Great and with the Winston Churchill example, and that there's not a lot of incentive to share negative information upwards, right? Like how many people are jumping at the bit to just share the worst things that are happening in your organization with your boss? And so I almost see this idea of like force field management, right? So there's this force field layer at every level of management, and only a little bit of bad information is trickling up. Primarily all that information is being kept down and all the good information is being let through, right? And so how does that allow us tackle the real issues that we're facing in organizations? It really doesn't. And so that's something that I think we need to address. And in doing that, one of the ways is to start rewarding smart failure. Like how many times do we reward smart failure? I said, just start handing out, I work at the Department of Commerce, just start handing out awards to folks who try things that are crazy, no one thinks can get them done, and see what folks are able to do, and start encouraging that type of behavior. I think that oftentimes we don't do that because we point fingers at what we can see, which is people, right? So we play the blame game. Oh, it was Joe's fault, or it was Kelly's fault, or it was Frank's fault. But we need to start pointing fingers at the dysfunctional systems that exist in our organizations. And I think one of the speakers said yesterday, until we start using we as a substitute for they, and think about shared accountability as a model, it's going to be really hard to get there. So, I mean, I strongly believe that when data is shared and it's used as an enabler of insights, amazing things can happen. And a lot of those amazing things can happen by asking very simple questions. One of the things that I've observed is that leaders are hesitant to ask very simple questions. They think they're going to come off as naive or they're going to come off as ignorant, when in fact, I actually think it's the most critical piece to performance management you can possibly employ. And I always say that there's really only 3 questions that you need to answer when you're looking to tackle an issue and try to figure out how you're going to track progress in that area. And the first is, what questions do we have that we don't have answers to? Right? So where do we not know what's going on and where do we need more information? That leads to the second question is, what data do we need to answer those questions? And then what contextual or learning indicators can help us better understand that environment? I think that by doing that, we're not only going to be able to use data in incredible ways, but we'll be able to better tell our stories and communicate our value and impact to the American people. And at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. So that leads me to my first question for our panel. And I'm going to ask each panelist to take about 2 to 3 minutes to answer this. And I'm going to play Oscar music if you go over time. So I'm going to be a stickler for that. So the question is, what do you think is the greatest opportunity for federal agencies right now in using data to ask the right questions and drive decision making across the organization? And I will start with Kate and we'll kind of move down the line.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And thanks for that inspiring speech. It's actually, I feel like maybe one of the things we could do is just bottle you and take you around all of the people that in federal government that are working on this. I'm going to take your Winston Churchill quote and raise you with a quote from Charles I.
Uh-oh, I know I shouldn't have brought it up.
Exactly. But just to kind of reiterate the point that this isn't anything, that a lot of the challenge here is that this isn't new. This is common sense in a lot of cases. Before he was summarily executed, Charles I made the observation, there's more to the doing than the bidding it be done. And I think one of the challenges we face in governments, whether it's in the UK or here in the US, is a sort of a sense that you know, we can say something, we can pronounce something, we can put something in a memo, we can put something in a white paper or green paper or whatever it is, and that it'll happen. And recognizing that, as Jeff's pointed out, what needs to happen to then implement change in very complicated public sector structures is very, very complicated and different. And actually the thing that performance management can do and that data can do is create the sort of glue and the tool set that enable leaders and teams, managers and their staff to actually make a difference. And so the thing that I would say, to bring it back to like what is the opportunity in the next year or so, is not to have, people think of an opportunity as let's do loads of new stuff. I'm like, actually, let's really double down on implementation of the things that we say are the most important. You may be aware the administration a couple of weeks ago announced its top 92 goals for all of the federal agencies and published them for the next 2 years. Those range from things as diverse and meaningful as disrupting terrorist gangs at the southwest border, to improving the education attainment results of young people in Indian Territory schools, to improving habitats for pollinators, like really important outcomes that we care about. How can we, as the federal government, support the teams and the leaders, especially the career leaders who are going to have to work through this to drive change and to deliver on those priorities. So I would say just doubling down on making progress on those and recognizing that this is about a kind of relentless focus and return to asking those questions, not all of which are complex questions, which are sometimes really simple questions, like what do we know? What is it telling us? What would we like to know? And keep asking those questions. And data is the lifeblood of those conversations. So that's my.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks.
John.
Talking about doubling down, one of the things that I think needs to be doubled down on is the emphasis on behavioral science. And just a question for everybody who's here today. Think about what is it that you are trying to do in your agency. We don't make anything, as Jeff likes to say. We don't make widgets here in the government. I don't think that's your quote exactly, but you've used it. We don't make widgets. So what are we doing? And more, as the Performance Institute is talking to more agencies, what we're seeing is ultimately we are trying to change people's behaviors. And you talk about complexity, Kate, it's so difficult to understand how do you change someone's behaviors? How do you get someone to stop smoking? How do you influence someone who speaks Pashto, is it Pashto, in Pakistan? How do you influence them on U.S. foreign policy, which, by the way, we're trying to do? How do you do these things? How do you know you're making progress? How do you know you're changing someone's attitude? How do you know you're even speaking to the right person? Who is influencing the conversation? How do you get on social media maybe and try to influence conversations in that way? And this is it's an elephant in the room for the government, because it's very clear once you start talking about it that that's actually what we're doing in government. But we've never really phrased it in those terms. We've never used the terms of behavioral science until I think this administration, and we got to give them a lot of credit for bringing this to the front and calling it out for what it is, which is we need to figure out the most efficient and effective way to influence people. That's the basic premise of many, if not most, government programs, at least the ones that are not entitlement programs. Entitlement programs would be a different story, but much of the rest of discretionary spending, and Robert, I'd be curious on your thoughts here, it seems like much of our discretionary spending goes to changing attitudes and behaviors in the public and internationally, et cetera. So why are we so basic? Why is our level of knowledge so basic on this topic of behavioral science? I feel like we're all at the first grade level, at least speaking for me and many of the people I talk to. They come right out and say, I don't know anything about behavioral science. I don't know who I should be talking to. So this is, I think, at its core, something that is incredibly essential for government, and it spreads out over so many mission sets that we have just begun to scratch the surface. And so, Jeff, that's really where I think, obviously it's going to take more than 12 months, but if we can just start to advance the conversation and the level of competency in this area, it would be huge. So
and just so everyone knows, there is a capability in the federal government right now that you can tap into. The General Services Administration has an Office of Evaluation Sciences. I think I got that right, Kate.
That is right.
Where the behavioral science team sits and has, you can call them up and they might be able to work with you on a particular project. So I would encourage you to do some research and check that out, and we can put you in touch with them if you have any questions. Great, Robert.
So just to respond a little bit to that, you're right, much of our discretionary spending does go to changing behavior. We've got great programs that are evidence of how the government's done that effectively. More Americans use their seatbelts when they get into a car, and that's dramatically reduced highway deaths. Smoking is more and more of a pariah's habit. Pardon me, those of you who remain a pariah. You should stop smoking. But we had really good tactics that we knew could change behavior, and those have been really effective. This builds on that tradition. Speaking of tradition, it occurs to me that this is a lot about transition. What's working now that we can ensure survives the next transition? Kate gives a very good example, Charles I, of a really bad transition, I guess. We hope nobody's summarily executed in the coming months. But it also leads me to quote a good American, finally, Thomas Jefferson, who sort of gives us the theme for this conference. You know, he was one of the first who said he hoped to see the nation's finances reported as openly and clearly as a tradesman's books. So congratulations to this group, Socrata, and its customers for advancing this cause, which is to be really clear about where the nation's money is going and what we're getting for that money. We have seen great advances over the last several years in the availability of data, and we've had unbelievable examples of leveraging that data for good in the last 36 hours. We're still not where we need to be, especially in the area of finances, in performance, of course, but there are major hurdles in front of us to get to what anybody would define as an adequate, honest depiction of the nation's finances. Big hurdles in the way of an unqualified opinion on the nation's financial statements, particularly DOD being a major hurdle, but others as well. But in addition to the widely greater availability of data is widely greater availability of evidence. And there's a distinction. When we report data on the performance of the behaviors we're trying to change, it may not be that what we're doing is causing the change in behavior. I'm reminded the governor of Delaware recently saw a drop in drunk driving accidents, which they had been trying to move for decades. And they couldn't really pinpoint the cause, only to find out later that it was the availability of Uber, a completely non-governmental intervention that has changed my life personally. But it's also keeping more and more drunk drivers off the road. But during the Bush administration and sustained during this administration has been a greater drive and reliance on rigorous evaluations of programs so you can isolate what we're doing from other factors. Unbelievable investments in those evaluations, starting with the Recovery Act, but beyond, sort of an agreement by the community that evaluations that are based on rigorous methodologies like randomized controlled trials are really what's needed to determine what's causing the impact and whether we're having a positive impact. And as more and more of those evaluations are completed, they are compiled in clearinghouses. And the Pew Charitable Trusts and the MacArthur Foundation have teamed to provide a clearinghouse of clearinghouses so that the various bodies that collect these evaluations are funneled through a central point at the Pew Charitable Trust to provide more and more access so that we can share these results and really learn together more and more about what's working so we can drive our limited discretionary funds into those programs and away from what unfortunately is the lion's share of programs which we know not to work.
All right, thank you, Robert.
Yeah.
Jatinder.
So So I've been sort of in the US for 6 years and really watching the administration, the agenda unfold, and there's enormous progress over that period. So one area that's interesting is that there's a much stronger focus on clearer goals and outcomes, and the 92 that Kate talked about is an example of that. But I also spent a lot of time with agencies, down in the weeds of organizations, and often what you get is the kind of disconnect between what's going on, around the White House and what's going on in agencies. And as you get deeper and deeper into it, actually people see the whole performance agenda sometimes as a compliance thing. And I think that in terms of unlocking data, it has to be about getting people from a world where they see data as a compliance type thing to a world where they see some data as something they can use to better manage their programs day to day. And let me sort of dig deep into one example, which is the federal government spends $800 billion on grants, approximately. Large tranche of government spending. Grantees, whether they're states or localities or non-profits or others, provide enormous amounts of data to grant-giving organizations in the federal government. That data is sometimes used and analyzed, often not, often collected and ignored. And one very, very simple but big change that could happen is a world where for grants, we collect data that we actually will use in the federal government. We promise that we will use it to analyze relative efficacy of different approaches on the ground, and maybe even give the data back to people who provide that data in a form that they can use it to better manage their programming. Grantees would love to know how they compare to other grantees, how whether they're more expensive or less expensive, whether their outcomes are better or worse. They'd love to be twinned with another grantee doing similar work so they can learn from each other. And yet, for so few federal programs, do you get that kind of activity? So, for me, it's about unlocking the potential of data, not by getting into big, complex, big data analytics stuff, but unlocking the potential of data by thinking of all the very many places where data gets collected and wasted, rather than the place, and just let's go from collecting and wasting to collecting the right data and using. And that's sort of the simple thing that I think a very large number of agencies can do.
Great, thanks, Jatinder. With those insights and kind of knowing what we know today, and the fact that we have 15 months left in this administration, we're facing a new administration after that, I'd hate to see all of the great progress that we've made kind of leave no matter who ends up winning the election. You have to think that there's going to be some customization of an approach no matter who's in office. I do think that we have made a lot of progress to date in terms of focusing on the use of data, and especially out of OMB and the performance function, really not making it about target attainment, but about understanding trends, looking at historical data, looking at current data, and then even looking at predictive data, and trying to figure out how do we make the best management decisions based upon what's staring us in the face right now, based on facts. And so I want to pose a question actually it's a two-part question to the panel. The first is, we do still have a significant amount of time left in this administration. I don't think we should move into coast mode. I don't think anyone would agree with that. So what should this administration do during the remaining time to sustain or grow a lot of the progress that we've made? And when the new administration comes in, what's the first thing that you would advise them to do to build off of that progress? And we'll start with Kate, and we'll move down the panel.
Okay, so I'm going to hone in on one thing that I think, when I think about the administration, I'm thinking especially about the centre and about OMB and the power that comes out of EOP. And I should also actually preface my answer with the fact that being a current federal employee, I'm probably going to be somewhat less controversial in my answers to this question than my colleague. So I'll give you a nice bland answer, but it's important. It's an important answer. So the thing that I'd say, again, and I'm kind of a bit obsessive about this, is I'm a great believer in following through and actually doing something something that you commit to. One of the things that's really good about the current administration's performance framework is there's a commitment to cross-cutting implementation. So the idea that many of the things that a government can achieve are not achieved by a single organisation working on its own in a silo. And I am constantly amazed by the number of very independent component and bureau organisations, even within federal departments. So this is an issue that can hit even within a single department. But thinking about areas where, and one of the areas I've worked a lot on is with the VA, Department of Defence and HHS on the Veterans Mental Health cross-agency goal. So these are three agencies really collaborating across agency boundaries to further an outcome. And I think, so we have 15 cross-agency goals at the moment. It's really, really hard to deliver cross-agency. One of the things that makes it really hard is because it's really hard to get any resources. OMB made a suggestion for a $15 million fund in the most recent to the Hill, and that didn't go anywhere. But we have, what we've tried to do is create some resources out of nothing. And so we're very grateful to federal agencies who have put forward some of their brightest and best talent at GS15, who will be part of the new White House Leadership Development Program, which is a cohort of really incredibly experienced, talented, and just exciting individuals who for the next year are going to be the kind of leadership, we're going to lead work on these cross-agency goals. So I think this is the kind of program that could sort of could be amazing or could be a total flop, and what will make it amazing is really working hard on it. But if we can show that with a small amount of really innovative, exciting central resource, we can make progress on these cross-agency goals, I think that can then help to, and segueing into the sort of what the first thing a new administration should do, to really hone in on what are the priorities of the administration. And I think as time goes on, there is something about saying as a centre of government and as a, whether it's number 10 or the White House, being really clear about and clearly communicating the areas, the priority areas that the centre of government can make a difference in. And that is oftentimes that white space between different organisations who need to work together to achieve an outcome. So I would hope that they wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Is that a phrase that works here? Mm-hmm. No. I have. Well thanks. I'm sure we made it up. The thing, I have very personal experience of a baby being thrown out with the bathwater, not a real one, a theoretical.
My God,
a theoretical performance baby. But I worked under the previous Labour administration on a framework of performance management that had lots of challenges and things that could have been better about it, but was showed pretty strong evidence of having a real impact and driving success. That entire edifice, everything was sort of wiped away in the space of a sentence.
Sounds oddly familiar.
No, so and I think that we need to think about how we tell that story, and the best way to tell the story, the best way to make these kinds of efforts compelling is to show impact and to show change and to show how with sort of talented people asking these questions using data, we can actually make a change. And then the final thing that is just like to kind of link back to data that I just raised, I think this administration has made huge strides in terms of lifting up the importance of open data. I hear a lot more when I talk to people in local and state government, and maybe this is just not this is words rather than action, but I hear a lot more conversation about how can we open data up to make it useful for our own managers. And I think there is a real interesting opportunity in federal government to just grapple with some of the extremely difficult challenges we have around the data that we use, and ask some questions around whether the open data agenda and that sort of and the kind of skill sets that are now in abundance all around us around data analytics could be used more effectively on the things on the indicators we're using to drive performance. So that's sort of like an opportunity that I think is a longer term one.
Great, thank you, Kate. Well, we're going to have to move into rapid fire round. I knew we were going to have to do this. There's way too much expertise up here on this panel. So I think we only have about 10 minutes left. So for the rest of the question, let's do 1 minute. This is my challenge to you guys. 1 minute on what this administration administration should do to sustain, and 1 minute on what the next administration should be focused on first thing to do. John, go.
I'll go. Well, I'm just going to tell a really quick story. I was called into a senior executive's office this week, and the man looked at me and said, you know, all these outcome-based measures are really great, but you know what? We're going to be held accountable for this. I'm not comfortable with any of this. How did we get here? I know I agreed to it 6 months ago, but I'm having second thoughts. So that was something that happened to me this week. And I think about, what Kate and Jeff said, and real quickly here, you got 12 months left, it's your 8th year, you're not running for office again. Can we give these people the safe space that they need somehow so I could avoid having those conversations at least for the next 12 months and get people to understand, finally, building on what you just said, that a target is different than a measure. Why is that such a hard concept for people? If you say, look, we're going to fight homelessness, people automatically jump to the conclusion that I'm going to be held accountable for 100% ending all homelessness. That's not what we mean. So that's something I think that we need to cover. The last thing I'm going to mention is, just building on Kate's comment, even with 2 organizations that I've dealt with recently who had a GAO report written about them, about how they couldn't work together. Even with those 2 organizations, they still wouldn't work together. And look, what can we do? Are we, if that's not, and the reason why was the reason they couldn't work together? The reason was they both thought their way of doing things was the best way, and that doing things the other person's way, or somehow even meeting in the middle on methods, was going to be somehow admitting that you were wrong or the other person was superior to you. Sure. So why is it so difficult to get people to work together? The money and the appropriations process is one reason, but there is also kind of this cultural issue where there doesn't seem to be any compelling reason to work with the other group. So that's 1 minute.
The built-in incentive isn't always there, or it's not always as obvious. Robert.
So I think we need to really improve collaboration across the board. OMB's management side and budget side aren't adequately collaborating. Entities within the White House enterprise aren't adequately collaborating. We need to do a much better job collaborating with Congress, making sure they're on board with these initiatives so that we can enhance the chance of them surviving.
How do we create demand in Congress for the information?
Well, there's a lot of demand. I mean, if you look like I do at the congressional schedule every week, there are substantive oversight hearings in all of these arenas every week. Those are opportunities where we need to drive this data. You also need to find, there are individuals staffing Congress who I think can be better allies. People who've been on this side who've been on the executive branch side, even at the OMB side, management side, that we can leverage to advance this. And then the data analytics. We've seen time and time in the last 36 hours examples of people putting up data, individuals, and people having to respond to what the data tells you. So I think there's an opportunity there. I also think there's an opportunity to lay better foundation for cost information. In all of what we're doing, there's a total absence of cost information. We're achieving performance outcomes at what cost? Each unit of outcome, compare the cost per unit of outcome of different programs. Evaluations need to not only isolate the impact of what we're doing, but at what cost. And there's a complete absence of that information. As far as the next administration is concerned, you've got a great strategic planning requirement. And from the top down, we have an opportunity to document priorities and use that strategic planning process, less than the document, to remind people to codify what those priorities are and lay out how we're going to measure it over time.
All right, thanks, Robert. Jatinder. Bring us home.
So I think that baby with the bathwater comment that Kate made is incredibly important, not just for the UK experience, but Robert built something called PART in the Bush administration, which wasn't perfect, but had lots of good things about it. And the first thing the Obama administration did was say, oh, it's a bad idea, let's get rid of it, mainly because it was affiliated with that last law. Governor O'Malley did some amazing stuff in Maryland. The first thing the new governor did is get rid of it, mainly because it was associated with the last law. So one good thing is that this has not been a period where we've had a lot of presidential attachment to the performance agenda, and that actually could be, at this moment in time, a good thing. So, the fact that this is not Obama's agenda, there was a little moment when the administration kept talking about the president's management agenda, which seemed like a slight throwback to the past, and in my view, rather odd. So there's a good thing there. But I think the other, good thing floating around is the Moneyball for Government movement. There is now, for the first time, a real opportunity to build a bipartisan belief in the importance of this work. Ryan will become maybe the Speaker of the House in the coming days. He's clearly seen as a sponsor. And I don't think the administration have done as well as they probably could and should have done, particularly on the performance agenda, as opposed to the evaluation agenda, to communicate clearly with the Hill the importance of this and build those bipartisan alliances. So I think there's a real opportunity to make sure that this is seen as bipartisan, and that baby with the bathwater risk is something that is mitigated. Yeah. And then all the other people who are doing much more day-to-day stuff, focus on really day-to-day stuff. Build capacity with career civil servants. Let's not worry about the politicals. They're way too busy looking for the next job. Let's focus on career public servants right now, much lower down in the machine to help them understand and drive it forward, because they're the people who turn up in the Secretary's office on day one and say, this is why this is important. And if they're not able to do that, it won't happen.
Great. Thank you, Jatinder. I know we're almost out of time. I would love to be able to take at least one question from the audience. I promised more earlier, and I apologize for that. Does anyone have a question for our panel that we can answer relatively quickly?
We didn't plan one.
One question. We're not breaking until we get one question. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kate, John, Robert, and Jatinder for joining today. Really appreciate it. A round of applause.